You see the news. Government spends $5 billion on another project while drowning in $36 trillion of debt. People panic. People get angry. But here's what nobody tells you. Almost every country on earth is in debt. India, Germany, Japan, even Switzerland. Japan owes TWICE its entire economy. The US, $36 trillion and climbing. So here's the real question. Why is every country in debt? Who are they borrowing from? And most importantly, who's getting rich off this system? Drop a comment if you've ever wondered this, because by the end of this video, you'll understand the game. Let's break it down. First, let's get clear on what we're actually talking about. National debt is the total money a country's central government owes, not your personal debt, not California's debt, just the federal government's debt. Think of it like this. When you need money, you take a loan from a bank. When governments need money, they borrow from other countries, big financial institutions, and even their own citizens. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You might be thinking, why don't they just print more money? Good question. Because when governments print money mindlessly, they flood the economy with cash. Prices skyrocket. Your money becomes worthless. This already happened in Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Their currency became literally worthless than toilet paper. Borrowing forces discipline. Debt comes with interest. So governments have to manage money more responsibly. They actually have to pay it back. If you want the full breakdown on why printing money causes inflation, I've got another video on that, link in the description. But now, the bigger question, why do governments borrow in the first place? That's next. Governments collect taxes. But sometimes, taxes aren't enough to cover expenses. Example, government collects $3 trillion in taxes but needs $4 trillion for schools, healthcare, roads. That's a $1 trillion gap. So what are the options? Option A. Cut spending. That means worse schools, underfunded hospitals, crumbling roads. People won't be happy. Protests start the next day. Option B. Raise taxes. Now life gets harder for everyone, even bigger protests. Option C. Borrow the difference. Easiest solution, kick the problem down the road. And we haven't even mentioned government corruption yet, but we'll get to that later. Maybe. Reason number 2. Investing in growth. Borrowing isn't always bad. Imagine your country needs roads, schools, hospitals, but has zero money and refuses to borrow. They'd have to wait years to save up. Meanwhile, people struggle with bad infrastructure. But if they borrow now, they can build now. People benefit sooner. The economy grows faster. That growth increases tax revenue, which eventually helps pay off the debt. That's the theory. At least. Reason number 3. Emergencies and crises. Wars, pandemics, natural disasters. When these hit, governments have no choice but to borrow fast. Example, in 2020, the US borrowed $3.8 trillion, about 18% of its entire GDP for COVID relief, stimulus checks, business aid. Without that, the economy collapses. Way more job losses. Total chaos. Borrowing during crises is actually one of the few times everyone agrees it makes sense. Reason number 4. Paying off old debt with new debt. Yes, you read that right. Governments take loans to pay off old loans. Here's how it works. Country borrows money in 2010. Due in 2020. But when 2020 arrives, they can't pay it back. So what do? Take another loan in 2020 to pay off the 2010 debt. And the cycle continues. Forever. Sound familiar? It's called a Ponzi scheme when regular people do it. But when governments do it, it's called debt management. As long as they manage it responsibly, it's not necessarily a problem. But when it spirals out of control, that's what happened to Sri Lanka in 2020. $51 billion in debt. Total default. Mass protests. Chaos. Reason number 5. Controlling inflation and interest rates. Sometimes governments borrow not because they're broke, but as a financial tool. By issuing bonds, they can pull money out of the economy to reduce inflation, inject money into the economy to stimulate growth. Control interest rates. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but that's the basic logic. Now that we know why countries borrow, the next question is, who's actually lending them all this money? Section 3. Who lends money to countries? 630 to 1045. Governments borrow trillions of dollars. You might be wondering, which bank has trillions sitting around? Answer. They don't borrow from just one source. They borrow from 3 main places. Source number 1. Domestic lenders, their own citizens. You can lend money to your own government. It's called buying bonds or treasuries. Here's how it works. You buy a U.S. Treasury bond, you're lending money to the government. They pay you back later, plus interest. Who buys bonds? Regular citizens. You, me, banks, Bank of America, Chase mutual funds, ETFs, even companies, even government agencies like Social Security. In fact, about 20% of U.S. debt is intragovernmental debt, the government borrowing from itself. Yeah, you can't make this up. Source number 2. Foreign lenders, foreign citizens, banks, and governments can also buy U.S. bonds. Examples: Japan owns about $1 trillion in U.S. debt. China owns around $700 billion. Why would they do this? Investment U.S. Treasury bonds are considered super safe. They get interest. It's stable. But here's the catch. They only buy bonds from stable economies. If your economy is weak, they won't trust you to pay them back. Instead, weaker countries have to go to organizations like World Bank loans for infrastructure projects. Asian Development Bank, similar IMF emergency loans. When you're completely broke and those loans, they come with strict conditions. The IMF is basically the lender of last resort. If you're begging the IMF for money, your country is in serious trouble. IMF loans require you to raise taxes, cut spending, privatize state-owned companies, and guess what happens? Protests, economic chaos. Greece, Argentina, Indonesia, all got worse after following IMF requirements. Source number 3. Central banks printing money. Kind of technically, governments can borrow from their own central bank. This is called debt monetization. The central bank prints new money and buys government bonds. But most countries don't do this anymore because it causes currency devaluation, hyperinflation, economic collapse instead. Central banks buy bonds indirectly from commercial banks that bought them first. This is done to control inflation and interest rates, not to actually fund the government. So now we know why countries borrow and who they borrow from. Next question, is debt actually bad? Section 4. Is national debt a bad thing? Short answer, it depends. Debt can be good or bad, depending on how it's used and whether a country can manage it. When debt is good, borrowing to build infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals, boosts the economy. Borrowing during crises like COVID stabilizes everything as long as debt is manageable. It's fine when debt is bad. If a country keeps borrowing just to pay off old debt, gives debt trap if debt grows too large. The government spends more on interest than essential services if investors lose confidence. They stop lending or demand higher interest rates, gives debt crisis, gives possible default. When a country defaults, it means they give up on paying their debt. Sri Lanka did this in 2022. Total chaos. Note, country defaulting is different from a business going bankrupt. Drop a comment if you want a full video on that. Closing parenthesis, how much debt is too much? One way to measure debt to GDP ratio, comparing total debt to the size of the economy. Example, 60% debt to GDP ratio means if a country has $100 billion GDP, its debt is $60 billion. Many economists say 60% or lower is safe, but it's not a strict rule. Some countries, like the US, have a debt ceiling, a legal limit on how much they can borrow. But here's the joke. Every time they hit the ceiling, they just raise it, to avoid default, forever. Section 5. Can a country be debt-free? Technically, yes. Realistically, no. Is there any country with zero debt? Answer, none. Every country in the world has some debt. The closest example is Macau, but Macau isn't even a country. It's a special administrative region of China. Macau can afford zero debt because tiny population, 700,000 people, tiny land area, half the size of Manhattan, earns billions from casinos more than Las Vegas. And no, we can't just turn the entire US into one giant Vegas to pay off debt, though that would be interesting. Why don't countries try to be debt-free? Because eliminating all debt would require massive spending cuts, people would riot. Huge tax increases, people would riot harder. Slow economic growth, everyone suffers also. No government debt means no government bonds. And bonds are critical for pension funds, low-risk retirement investments, financial markets, safe investment options. Without bonds, pensions would be forced into riskier assets. Retirements become less secure. Markets become more volatile. So what's the conclusion? Debt is a double-edged sword. Used wisely helps a country grow and thrive. Used recklessly leads to economic disaster. The question isn't why does our country have debt? The question is, can they manage it responsibly? And maybe you're still wondering, why do some countries handle high debt fine while others collapse? What happens when a country actually defaults? Who really profits from all this debt? Maybe that's for another video. We're out of time. If you want me to make videos on what happens when countries default, government corruption and debt, who actually profits from the debt system, drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe. Because the more you understand the system, the less they can fool you. Thanks for watching.